The ruling did not arrive like a whisper within the ancient corridors of the palace. It landed like thunder inside the royal household, cutting through decades of silence, forced loyalty, and deeply buried family wounds that had long been hidden from the public eye. King Charles was completely devastated as senior judges officially ruled that Prince Louis, the youngest son of the Prince and Princess of Wales, and not the reigning king, not Queen Camilla, and absolutely not any senior palace figure, would legally inherit Princess Diana's private estate suite. In one monumental judicial decision, the painful past returned with absolute power, stripping the crown of its control over a piece of history it had tried desperately to manage for nearly 30 years. Charles knew every single person in that legal briefing room understood the immense weight of what was coming next. He sat rigidly at the head of the highly polished oak table, his hands perfectly still, his face tightly controlled, while senior legal advisors waited with bated breath for the sealed judgment folder to be opened. The private royal legal briefing room was historically meant for quiet decisions, the kind of sensitive family matters that never reached the ears of the public or the intrusive press. But this specific situation was entirely different. This was not a routine matter of property management or royal protocol. This was the name of Diana entering the grand room once again, not as a fading memory, not as a lingering grief, but as a binding law that no monarch could rewrite. Prince William stood nearby with a heavy silence that felt sharper and more dangerous than any speech. The future king did not interrupt when the head advisor began reading the legal document, yet every single word seemed to land squarely against him as a grieving son, as a protective father, and as the future sovereign of the realm. The judgment was brutally clear and left no room for palace interpretation. Prince Louis would legally inherit Diana's private estate suite, which is defined as a strictly protected collection of private rooms, highly personal belongings, and unique estate-linked privileges that have been preserved under her name since her tragic passing. An estate suite, in plain legal terms, meant much more than physical rooms or valuable jewelry. It meant a private, untouchable legacy tied to property access, emotional memory, and unique legal rights that sat completely outside the ordinary administration of the royal household. That was the exact reason why the ruling mattered so deeply to everyone involved. It did not simply give young Prince Louis something of immense material value. It intentionally placed the unfinished story of Princess Diana directly into the innocent hands of her youngest grandson. King Charles lowered his eyes to the table when the final words of the judgment were read aloud. The king had faced immense national mourning, catastrophic family ruptures, and decades of relentless public judgment. But this specific ruling struck somewhere much deeper, touching a part of his life he thought had been permanently settled. Diana's legacy had officially moved beyond his royal reach. The High Court judges had confirmed that the private estate suite had been fiercely safeguarded by a highly confidential private clause, a strict legal condition specifically written into her final documents to keep it entirely away from future royal interference or palace modifications. A clause is a specific, unyielding rule inside a legal document, and this particular one carried a devastating force because it limited the power of even the reigning monarch himself. Charles could not soften its terms. He could not reinterpretation its meaning, and he could not command it to go away with a royal decree. William understood the second, more painful blow before anyone in the room even attempted to explain it. His son Louis had not just inherited beautiful rooms or historic possessions. He had inherited a powerful emotional symbol that the monarchy could no longer control or exploit. Then came the definitive sentence that changed the very air inside the briefing room completely. No reigning monarch could ever override Diana's named bloodline condition once it had been officially triggered by the courts. Charles slowly set the judgment folder down without uttering a single word. William watched his father closely, torn between natural family sympathy and a fierce parental resolve to protect his son. Then, one senior advisor leaned forward and whispered quietly that Queen Camilla had not yet been told the full, devastating meaning of the ruling. But before Camilla could even react or protest, the palace had to face the reality of the people whose names were now legally bound to Diana's legacy forever. Behind this historic judgment were not just legal signatures, strict clauses, and official court seals. There were living, breathing people, each carrying a completely different wound from the exact same chapters of royal history. Charles saw a haunting past that he could never truly escape. William saw a long-delayed promise finally being restored to his mother's memory. Young Louis stood at the absolute center of a massive legacy he was still far too young to fully comprehend, while Camilla faced a silent legal decision that quietly redrew her entire place within the royal household. Charles stood completely alone after the briefing ended, holding the closed judgment folder as if its physical weight had completely altered in his hands. The king had heard incredibly difficult words throughout his long life, but this specific ruling did not feel like a matter of politics, royal duty, or standard palace procedure. It felt deeply, painfully personal. It carried Diana's name directly into the present day with a force that he possessed no power to soften. He tried his best to think like a sovereign, to view the matter through the lens of the crown, but personal memory kept breaking through his defense. Every single line written in that folder reminded him that Diana's private world had now become legally untouchable, even by the very crown he wore upon his head. William understood the underlying pain in a completely different way. The prince was not only protective father of young Louis, he was first and foremost Diana's son, and that dual role made the court ruling both incredibly tender and politically dangerous. He knew the public would never see this inheritance as a simple, mundane transfer of private property between generations. They would see it as Princess Diana reaching forward through time itself, placing a sacred piece of her soul into the hands of her grandson. That was the precise reason why William felt a quiet, immovable resolve instead of a loud triumph. Louis was still far too young to carry such a massive historical meaning, and the prince knew his absolute duty as a father was not to turn the young boy into a public symbol, but to protect him from becoming one far too soon. Charles felt uniquely exposed because the ruling did something no clever palace statement could ever hide or spin. It drew a sharp legal boundary around Diana's legacy and told the entire royal household that some doors could never be opened by rank, by title, or by centuries of royal tradition. The king could easily command grand state ceremonies, approve official royal roles, and shape the public duty of every family member. But he could not reach into that single protected space. For Charles, that truth cut incredibly deep into his pride. It suggested to the world that Diana's memory had been granted a legal shield that was significantly stronger than royal authority itself. Then came the quieter, more toxic tension surrounding Camilla. The legal advisors already fully understood what the ruling meant for her daily life within the palace. Certain estate-linked rooms, private privileges, and highly symbolic rights would no longer sit within the ordinary reach or administration of the queen consort's household. Camilla's position had not been attacked openly or aggressively by the courts, yet it had been narrowed and restricted in a way that everyone inside the palace walls could instantly feel. The queen consort would soon learn the hard way that Diana's private world had been placed permanently beyond her influence, and that heavy knowledge moved swiftly through the palace corridors before anyone actually dared to speak it aloud to her face. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, quietly became the calm center of this gathering storm. She understood William's protective silence. She felt Charles's deep emotional hurt, and she recognized Louis's complete innocence all at the same time. She knew this profound inheritance would eventually have to be explained to their son with immense care, using love rather than royal ceremony, and focusing on privacy rather than public spectacle. William finally turned to his senior advisor and quietly asked for Diana's old estate file to be brought directly from the royal archives, completely unaware that one buried incident inside those old papers would explain exactly why the specific judicial ruling had become completely inevitable in the modern era. And the very moment that archive file was opened, the true, hidden beginning of this family crisis was no longer concealed beneath complex legal language. Every major royal crisis always has a specific, hidden moment that everyone remembers far too late. For this particular inheritance battle, it was not the recent court hearing, it was not the final judgment, and it was certainly not the stunned silence inside the palace walls. It had actually begun many years earlier on a private night, when one locked door, one intense conversation, and one firm refusal changed the entire future of Diana's estate forever. The ultimate answer was buried deep inside the Windsor Archive dinner records. It was a private family gathering that had once seemed completely painful, but safely contained by time. It occurred immediately after a formal memorial review, when Diana's estate suite was quietly and intensely discussed by those senior royals who truly believed the sensitive matter could still be managed permanently inside the palace walls. The dinner was never meant to become a turning point in history. It was originally intended to permanently close a difficult, agonizing chapter of the past. Yet, that single night became the hidden trigger, the one defining moment that everyone later looked back on and realized had changed the trajectory of the family forever. Charles remembered the old, detailed inventory list being placed directly before him. The king had seen countless royal inventories throughout his duties, but this specific list carried an entirely different kind of psychological pressure. It meticulously named Diana's private rooms, her carefully preserved personal belongings, and the unique estate-linked rights that were legally attached to them. Each individual line on that paper forced the family to face a monumental question they had successfully avoided for decades. Should the private suite remain permanently protected under Diana's own direct bloodline? Or should it finally be folded into the wider royal household as part of ordinary palace management? That question mattered immensely because control over the physical suite meant absolute control over how Diana's memory would be handled by the institution. It also mattered because any decision made on that fateful night would inevitably shape exactly what her grandchildren would one day inherit. William had not shouted or lost his temper during the discussion. The prince had absolutely no need to. His grief had transitioned over the years into something controlled, adult, and immensely dangerous in its absolute calmness. He flatly refused to ever let Diana's private suite become a mere ceremonial space, polished, manicured, and superficially explained to tourists by palace officials who had never carried the agonizing weight of her loss the way he had to him. Doing so would have turned a sacred memory into a cheap public display. It would have taken something deeply personal and placed it under the exact same rigid royal system that had ultimately failed to protect her when she was alive. William's firm refusal came from a place of deep, unyielding pain, but it also came from an absolute loyalty to his mother's true nature. He knew that Diana's name still moved the heart of the entire nation because the public believed she belonged to them emotionally, even when cold palace rules tried their best to contain her. Charles had hesitated deeply when the independent trustees asked whether the suite should remain strictly under bloodline protection. The king felt the heavy pull of institutional authority going one way, and a familiar weight of personal guilt pulling him in the exact opposite direction. Sensing the gridlock, a senior trustee quietly recorded William's passionate objection and officially attached it to Diana's old estate protection clause, creating the hidden legal rule that years later gave the high court judges their absolute legal key to rule in favor of Prince Louis. The legal attachment created from that historic Windsor Archive dinner did not just remain a dormant piece of paper hidden in the dark corners of the palace archives. It actively transformed into a ticking time bomb that officially detonated the very moment the high court judges interpreted its true statutory meaning. No senior royal aide had ever anticipated that Prince William's past emotional pushback would successfully provide the bulletproof legal framework required to strip the reigning monarch of his territorial authority over Princess Diana's private estate suite. King Charles found himself completely cornered by the ghost of his own past hesitations, forced to realize that the formal confrontation between himself and his eldest son had finally arrived at a point of absolute non-negotiable reality. The palace machine had successfully spent decades absorbing highly volatile public scandals, silencing aggressive tabloid gossip, and carefully softening controversial official statements, but possessed absolutely no mechanism to soften the raw legal power generated when a father and a son faced each other with Diana's untouchable legacy sitting directly between them on the table. No secretary spoke during that long encounter. No elite courtiers dared to interrupt the heavy silence, and the official judgment folder lay undisturbed on the polished surface, like an invisible third presence demanding full submission from the crown. Charles had urgently summoned William to the private study, precisely because maintaining a detached, comfortable silence had become completely impossible for stability of the household. The king strategically chose a small room situated far away from administrative offices, hovering secretaries, and formal audio recordings because he understood this was no longer a standard constitutional crisis, but a deeply personal family wound that had been violently ripped open by an external judicial ruling. He desperately wanted to project a sense of sovereign control, but absolute control was exactly what the court judgment had systematically stripped from his hands the moment it was signed by the judges. When William entered the private room, the prince carried the exact same cold, unyielding calm that had completely unsettled the independent state trustees during the archive dinner years prior. He did not walk into the room as a petulant rebel or a modern modernizer looking to disrupt ancient traditions. He came strictly as Diana's fiercely loyal son, and as Prince Louis's protective father, and that specific dual identity made every single word he uttered carry an immense, undeniable weight. Charles began the intense conversation with the exact question that had been burning through the minds of palace officials ever since the ruling was first read aloud. The king demanded to know if William truly understood the massive, unprecedented psychological pressure this specific inheritance would inevitably place upon young Prince Louis. He questioned whether it was fair to tie the identity of a young child so tightly to Diana's emotionally charged private estate suite, noting that the public would never look at the boy without seeing the tragic shadow of his late grandmother. The king's voice carried a distinct tremor of deep-seated fear beneath his usual sovereign authority, because he knew Louis was not merely receiving a collection of beautiful rooms and historic assets. He was effectively becoming the living, breathing center of a historical narrative that the monarchy had never been able to successfully contain or control. That specific reality mattered immensely because the British public would never view this high court ruling as a mundane piece of legal paperwork. They would view it as Diana's enduring memory actively choosing a future path for the monarchy through her grandson's bloodline. William answered his father with immense care, keeping his tone measured and respectful, but he absolutely did not bend the position even a single millimeter. The prince stated clearly that Louis had never asked for this massive inheritance, and the innocent child should never be made to suffer or carry emotional burdens simply because the adults in the family had failed to settle Diana's complex legacy with absolute honesty and transparency decades ago. But he also looked directly into the king's eyes and asserted that his mother's final wishes deserved absolute, uncompromising legal protection from palace interference. He firmly reminded Charles that the private estate suite was not a political trophy to be won, not a tactical weapon to be used in family disputes, and certainly not a royal embarrassment that could be quietly managed away or hidden from public sight by clever public relations advisors. It was, in its truest essence, the very last guarded, untainted space of a woman whose name still carried an immense wave of public pain, unconditional love, and completely unfinished truth. Charles felt his deep devastation sharpen into a rare, painful moment of absolute clarity as he looked at his son. The king openly admitted that every single decision involving Diana's memory still felt like a direct, crushing judgment on his past actions and historical choices. He confessed that he could successfully rule an entire nation and command global respect, yet he remained completely powerless to escape that specific old shadow walking behind him. Then, William delivered a precise legal revelation that completely cut through the remaining tension in the room. The prince explained that the high court judges had not relied solely on the technical clauses written in the original will, but had heavily based their final ruling on the officially recorded objection from the Windsor Archive dinner, which Charles himself had signed and validated out of historical guilt. Charles slowly turned away toward the window. Deeply wounded by a legal truth he could no longer deny or fight against. William did not raise his voice to celebrate his victory. He simply stood up and stated that the fundamental question was no longer about who controlled Diana's physical memory, but rather who within the family was truly worthy of guarding it with honor. And beyond that closed study door, an entirely separate force within the palace was already frantically calculating exactly what privileges the ruling had permanently taken away from the current hierarchy. Diana's private estate suite was never just a set of physical rooms or beautifully preserved apartments inside the palace walls. It was emotional memory armed with formidable legal teeth, sentiment turned into genuine constitutional power, and deep grief protected by unyielding clauses that no senior palace official could ever erase with a stroke of a pen. As the independent trustees meticulously explained the long-term operational impact of the ruling, one undeniable truth became completely impossible for the royal household to ignore. Prince Louis had inherited much more than a private sanctuary. He had officially inherited a legal boundary that completely restricted the monarch's personal discretion. Charles eventually entered the trustees' chamber with the distinct heaviness of a man who already knew the devastating answer, but desperately needed to hear exactly how far the legal restrictions extended. The king had just faced William across the rawest emotional wound in the family. Yet this formal meeting with the lawyers made the institutional pain completely official. William remained perfectly controlled as he sat beside Princess Catherine. But the prince carried a completely different kind of protective tension now. He was no longer just defending his mother's abstract memory. He was listening carefully to the exact legal shape of the massive responsibility that had officially fallen onto his youngest son's shoulders. A senior legal advisor slowly opened the thick estate file and began explaining the complex protection structure piece by piece to the gathered royals. Trustees, in plain legal terms, were the officially appointed guardians responsible for managing protected family assets according to strict, legally binding instructions rather than personal preferences or shifting palace politics. That distinction mattered immensely because Diana's estate suite had never been left loose or flexible for palace interpretation. It had been placed under a fiercely guarded legal framework that tightly bound preserved private apartments, estate-linked ceremonial rights, and highly restricted personal holdings directly to her independent bloodline legacy. The suite was not a museum piece or mere historical decoration. It was a legally protected space built specifically around restricted access, direct bloodline inheritance, and emotional memory. Catherine watched William's facial expression closely as each restrictive detail was read aloud by the lawyer. She saw a flicker of quiet victory in her husband's eyes, but she also recognized the immense, heavy burden that accompanied it. Louis was still a completely innocent child, yet his name had now become permanently attached to one of the most emotionally charged and publicly scrutinized legacies in modern royal history. Catherine understood perfectly why this matter extended far beyond material wealth or physical luxury. She knew that if this inheritance was handled carelessly or allowed to become a public spectacle, young Louis could easily be pulled into intense public expectations long before he was old enough to understand the complex history he had inherited. However, if handled with immense parental care and strict privacy, Diana's memory could be successfully protected without turning their youngest son into a political symbol before his time. Charles gripped the edge of the large table tightly when the legal advisor reached the absolute sharpest point of the ruling. The lawyer stated clearly that the Crown possessed absolutely no legal authority to repurpose the suite for official state visits or fold it into ordinary household use without obtaining Prince Louis's formal consent when he reached the age of majority. The king could not change its structure, could not use it for grand ceremonies, and could not treat it as ordinary crown property. That specific limitation deeply wounded his institutional pride because it proved to the entire world that even his sovereign authority had a strict legal border. Then came the definitive clarification that everyone in the room had been waiting for with immense anxiety. The advisor confirmed that Queen Camilla could not claim any form of symbolic access or administrative rights to the space through Charles, because a high court judgment completely separated Diana's private estate suite from the monarch's personal discretion or marital property. William did not react openly to the statement, but the prince fully understood the immense historical power of that single sentence. A sealed legal instruction officially confirmed that the suite must remain exclusively connected to Diana's direct descendants, with Louis named as the officially activated heir to the legacy. Catherine let the heavy silence settle over the room for a moment, before quietly asking the one question that no advisor wanted to answer directly. She asked exactly when and how Queen Camilla would be officially told the full extent of her exclusion from the space. The senior advisor slowly closed the thick estate file, and the temperature inside the room seemed to turn instantly colder. The answer to her question came much sooner than anyone within the palace hierarchy wanted, and the very first wave of institutional fallout began right behind a door that Camilla had fully expected to open without resistance. For Queen Camilla, the devastating reality of the High Court ruling did not manifest within the crowded walls of a public courtroom, but inside a quiet, dimly lit palace corridor where history drew an unyielding line. There was no explosive argument, no theatrical announcement, and not a single raised voice to disturb the heavy afternoon air. There was only a heavy locked door, a modified security instruction, and the sharp, painful knowledge that Princess Diana's private world had been placed permanently beyond her reach. Camilla arrived that morning fully expecting the usual administrative order, having been told there would be a routine structural briefing regarding palace space allocation. It was supposed to be the kind of controlled, polite meeting where institutional adjustments were softened by diplomatic language and deferential faces. But the queen consort instantly sensed something was fundamentally wrong the moment she discovered a senior household officer standing like a guard before the entrance to the private estate suite corridor. He did not offer his customary warmth. He did not bow with his usual ease, and he absolutely did not step aside to let her pass. That was a precise moment when the heavy silence became its own official announcement, and Camilla understood with sudden clarity that the high court judgment had instantly moved from legal paper into physical action. The officer cleared his throat and explained with immense formal regret that under the binding judicial ruling, the entire suite was now legally preserved for Prince Louis and could not be entered for the scheduled household review. A household review, in plain palace terms, meant an internal administrative inspection of room conditions, access schedules, and potential ceremonial usage by current senior royals. That distinction mattered immensely because Camilla had fully expected the royal household to retain subtle administrative power over the physical space, even if the legal ownership had technically shifted to the young prince. Instead, the officer's measured words made the brutal truth undeniable. Diana's private estate suite was no longer a part of ordinary palace management. It had been placed behind a fortified legal boundary that carried Prince Louis's name exclusively. Camilla did not speak at first, freezing in mid-step before slowly and deliberately removing her glove, a small, highly controlled movement that revealed far more profound humiliation than any loud outburst of anger ever could. The Queen Consort had successfully survived decades of intense public judgment, fierce private suspicion, and relentless historical comparisons. But this specific moment was entirely different. This was not speculative tabloid gossip. This was not a fleeting headline. This was Diana's protected world actively refusing her entry through the absolute power of the law. For Camilla, the sharpest pain came from what that locked door represented. It told her in no uncertain terms that no matter how high she stood beside King Charles, and no matter what title she held, there were still sacred places in a royal story where her authority simply ended. King Charles appeared in the corridor moments later, visibly strained and exhausted by the exact confrontation he had spent weeks fearing. The king looked at Camilla, then at the silent officer, and for the first time in his long reign, his grand sovereign title gave him absolutely nothing useful to offer. She looked at him expecting reassurance, waiting for some quiet sign that he could still override the bureaucratic restriction. But Charles knew he was completely powerless. Even his direct royal authorization could not bypass the court condition because the judges had explicitly separated Diana's suite from royal household control. The monarchy could not bend a specific rule without collapsing the validity of the entire judgment. Another officer stepped forward to deliver the final symbolic blow, confirming that Camilla's scheduled review had been officially removed from the internal palace list, proving the decision was already being strictly enforced. The Queen Consort turned away without a single word of protest, carrying the invisible wand in absolute silence. Charles remained standing alone in the corridor, staring blankly at the door he could no longer open for his wife. But the true emotional turning point did not come from legal officials or locked doors. It came from a private conversation that occurred immediately after the shock settled. Charles and William met once again, not as sovereign and heir, but as a father and a son standing directly in the long shadow of Diana's name. The room was much smaller this time. The voices were considerably lower, and what passed between them fundamentally changed the ultimate meaning of the judgment. Charles asked for the meeting because the incident in the corridor had broken something deep inside his pride. The king had watched the woman he loved walk away from an untouchable boundary, and that profound powerlessness followed him long after the officers had left. Yet when William arrived, Charles did not speak with standard royal authority. He spoke like a father who had finally realized that the court ruling had exposed something much larger than a legal limit. It had exposed a decades-old family wound that had never truly closed. William noticed a shift instantly, finding his father sitting quietly with Diana's old estate file closed between them on the desk. That detail mattered immensely because the file was no longer being utilized as an institutional weapon or a protective shield. It was simply allowed to sit there, heavy with history. An estate file, in plain terms, was a complete official record holding the strict instructions, protections, and personal choices tied to Diana's legacy. For Charles, it had become a crushing mirror, while for William, it had become absolute proof that the past could never be buried without consequences. Charles openly confessed that the ruling devastated him because it made him feel permanently judged by history itself. Every written clause seemed to speak with Diana's distinct voice, and every restriction felt like a painful reminder of choices he could never remake. He admitted he had once feared her legacy would permanently divide the family, setting one generation against another in an endless battle for public sympathy. But now, after witnessing Camilla's silent humiliation and William's steady resolve, the king finally accepted a darker truth. The wound had not been healed by time. It had only grown stronger beneath the surface. William softened his posture slightly, but he did not retreat from his position. The prince gently explained to his father that Louis's inheritance should never be viewed as a historical punishment or a tactical defeat. It was protection, a sacred boundary placed around Diana's memory, so that no future palace official could ever reshape her story for institutional comfort or convenience. William promised that Louis would be raised to fully understand the suite as a profound emotional responsibility, not as a weapon against Charles, not as a humiliation for Camilla, and certainly not as a cheap trophy for the public to consume. That promise mattered immensely because it gave the legal victory a human purpose far beyond the politics of the court. Charles listened without a single interruption, before slowly placing his hand on the closed file and quietly agreeing that Diana's name would permanently remain exactly where the High Court judgment had placed it. With that private surrender, the palace machine prepared its formal response. But outside the locked gates, the public had already made the story entirely their own. By the following morning, the sensitive ruling had escaped the palace walls and entered the national imagination with unstoppable force. It was no longer a dense legal decision about property allocation. It had transformed into a sweeping narrative about memory, direct bloodline, and whether the modern monarchy could survive being corrected by its own history. A major London newspaper placed Diana's elegant silhouette across its front page beside the bold words, "Louis inherits her private world." In that single simple phrase, the entire meaning of the judgment shifted permanently. It no longer belonged to court language. It belonged to the hearts of the people. Broadcasters framed the ruling as a generational transfer of emotional authority, moving away from Charles's wounded era toward William's children and the future they represented. That mattered because the monarchy does not survive by law alone. It survives through collective feeling, loyalty, and trust. The estate suite had become a powerful symbol of all three. Outside Kensington Palace, a quiet crowd gathered to leave white flowers, standing in a silence that proved Diana's memory remained unbreakable. People were not merely reacting to property. They were celebrating the feeling that after decades of palace tension, a piece of her soul had been successfully defended by her family. William saw the extensive coverage and felt the immediate danger of public pressure, but Catherine reassured him, knowing that if handled with absolute love, the legacy would protect their son rather than overwhelm him. Palace officials eventually released a highly restrained statement confirming full respect for the judicial verdict, while avoiding any language that sounded like institutional defeat. Charles read the front page alone in his study, finally accepting the hardest truth of his entire life. The crown could successfully manage grand ceremonies and guard heavy doors, but it could never control how the world remembered Princess Diana. In the end, the judgment did not destroy the monarchy. It stripped away an old illusion. It proved that some legacies are simply too powerful to be absorbed by crowns or hidden behind palace walls. Diana's private estate swept past the Prince Louis, but the deeper, enduring inheritance belonged to everyone forced to face what her memory still means. The door to the past stayed permanently closed, but for the future of the crown, it officially opened a path toward genuine, long-awaited peace.